It's another episode of Declassify. I feel like these are happening at a faster rate than I had initially anticipated, so thanks to every person who has been listening along. I've been enjoying all of the engagement with the podcast so far, so do keep on writing to me, and if you're game, even send some topic suggestions or even questions my way, and I'll see if I can build it into the rest of this season. But back to the point of this week, I'm so pleased to introduce our guest, who is a composer, researcher and teacher, who is someone that I actually studied with back at the Sydney Conservatorium, and it is none other than electroacoustic extraordinaire Alexis Weaver. You'll get to hear some of her music throughout this episode and hear her talk about the realm of electronic or electroacoustic or acousmatic music and how this works within classical music and classical music discourse. So welcome aboard, Alexis.
Hi, Vicky. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited.
I'm so glad to have you on, so it's my pleasure. And I was thinking about a way to start with you. So specifically, I'd be quite interested in knowing more about how your practice works or more about how your practice has developed. You've managed to join what you do as a sound artist with composition. For example, the earlier training that we both did together in classical music and now moving very deeply into electronic music. And you're also a researcher and a teacher at the Con.
Okay, so for me, I started out, as you said, Vicky, in the composition program at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And I expected that my path would be one to instrumental composition. I was very interested in sort of very rhythmic, modal chamber music, sort of in the vein of Ross Edwards, I suppose, and that kind of sound. And then as I moved through, I began to feel like I was out of my depth with instrumental music. I wasn't really connecting with it in the way that I thought that I would, or flourishing in the way that I'd hoped. For some reason, just the way that instrumental composition was taught and the way that we studied, it didn't resonate with me, and that was becoming more and more of a problem because I felt that I wasn't really finding my own compositional voice. And then as part of our compulsory studies, we were all introduced to electroacoustic music and sort of music technology, which I remember thinking was a big waste of my time. I'm already falling behind in where I'd like to be. So why should I be learning a whole new computer program and thinking about sound when I need to be spending all the time I can on getting my head around instrumentation and orchestration and harmony and harmonic progressions and making that work for me. But I'm so glad that it was compulsory, because slowly having to do the compulsory units and then going to one-on-one lessons with my first teacher, who was Dr. Ivan Zavada, I discovered that working with sound rather than notations and notated instruments made a lot more sense to me and my brain and how it works. So thinking about the musical concepts in different ways to shape sound objects and to create soundscapes rather than to create a through composed instrumental composition, it just clicked. And so from there, I moved more and more into that kind of study. So moving my listening from classical and romantic composers to late 20th century electroacoustic composers, and getting to know how we've moved on from those initial ideas of people like Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. And then from there, during my honours year, I composed only electroacoustic works and moved on to my master's, and it's really it's been electroacoustic from there on in. Yeah, so that's where I got to where I am today.
Which is really cool, because now you're teaching there as a tutor in electronic music now.
Yes, I am. So I sort of kept going at the Con when I began my Master of Music. I felt that I hadn't learnt everything that I needed to in the time that we had about acousmatic music and aesthetics in particular. So I kept going, and I used my Masters as a way to really hone my skills and my techniques in that area of music. And eventually there was an opening for some teaching work in one-on-one composition with the second year students, which was my first sort of exposure to that as well. So took that on, and that was a big learning curve. And now I'm teaching some music technology classes and some music theory classes as well.
And music theory specifically in acousmatic music?
Oh, actually, one of the just the first year sort of introductions to music research and discussion around musical opinions, which I think tied in really nicely, because even though it wasn't electroacoustic, I felt that with my experience and looking at classical music sort of from an external space now, I'm sort of able to encourage diverse opinions on classical music and our sort of Western traditions. So it tied in really well for me, I felt, and I really enjoyed teaching that subject.
And when you mean looking at it from an external place, is it because that electronic music sometimes isn't considered part of classical music practices or traditions?
Yeah, I think that's right. For me, I'm not sure where it sits for me. I know that electroacoustic music is certainly art music in the same way. And I do feel that we have many of the same goals and processes, really. But I feel like the way that we arrive at that point is so different that I haven't quite made up my mind as to whether it can be considered in the same way. But I do feel that as an electroacoustic composer, I do look in on the Western classical music tradition more than participate in it. We're coming from a genre of music that's so new, and I feel like that gives you a lot more freedom to break with the traditions of classical music composition, which can be scary at times as well.
In fact, I think from memory, when we were studying the compulsory electronic classes together, a lot of the roots of electronic music itself come from a classical tradition, or at least people who were what we would now categorize as classically trained, either in fine art or classical music.
Absolutely, as well as other disciplines such as architecture. For example, Xenakis dabbled in electroacoustic music, and the the early sort of people that we call the pioneers of electroacoustic music often teamed up with architects such as Varese, who was a sort of a friend of Le Corbusier, and yeah, and Xenakis worked with him as well. So it's people came to electroacoustic music from a wide range of disciplines, but certainly classical music was one, and developed this new way of seeing sound and seeing music and how it could work with our modern technology, which I think is amazing. Yeah, and how it can exist in spaces that we exist in. So introducing new dimensions to art music, space and time, as we walk through a space as well. From there, I feel like it evolved so much that today, people do question whether all sound art and electroacoustic composition could be um, seen in the same way as our classical art music. So I think that's a question that everyone has to answer themselves, really. But I think regardless whether it can be seen as some other art form rather than classical music, it needs to be respected in the same way, because as far as I can see, the exact same time and consideration goes in, just in different areas. Mm.
And because you're talking about, well, perhaps early on, the relationship between architecture and sound and how that may inform processes or experiences of it being spatial, would that then increase public accessibility or access to pieces of music that are electronically generated or performed, as you don't necessarily need to be in a concert hall? Often spaces that are set up, even outdoor spaces, such as Vivid Festival being a big example, setting up spaces where people can have these experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Space being a creative element in electronic music means that it can be accessed in different ways, and that's something that we can capitalize on as composers and sound artists. For example, the amazing array of sound installations that you find in art galleries now, I think that's a beautiful crossover and something which really makes a new connection for consumers of art. And you also have electronic music existing in spaces outside academic institutions, in bars and nightclubs, at open mic electronic nights where we have live electronic performers hooking up to the stereo speakers and then going crazy on whatever they bring with them. So I think that's wonderful. And I think on that, space has been harnessed in such a powerful way through the use of surround sound and ambisonic formats for electroacoustic composers, which just shows how the dimension of space can be used so powerfully to evoke artistic responses in people. And that is a wonderful innovation, which we've been able to do with modern technology. But on the other side, I think it's really important that we remain dedicated to creating immersive and valuable works in really simple spaces, for example, headphones and on iPods and for CD players, and in the stereo space, those ways of listening to music that everyone can access, even if you can't get to the concert hall. Otherwise, I think that in terms of accessibility, and getting music outside of institutions and away from concert halls, electroacoustic artists are no better than anyone in the classical space. And not to say that anyone's better anyway if they make their music more accessible, but it certainly means that more people might be able to enjoy it, which I think is a good thing.
Well, actually, I have to ask, just in case there's someone listening who doesn't know what it means, but what is ambisonic?
So in order to make this as accessible as possible for everyone listening, just a quick breakdown of large diffusion spatial formats for composing sound. So when we say surround sound, we might be talking about having speakers to the front of you, to the side and to the back, with a sub speaker for the really low frequency content, and that starts to create an immersive experience. So you might have 5 speakers, you might have 7 or 8, going up to as many as you want and can afford. So that's surround sound. And then even more immersive in the spatial sense is something like an ambisonic array, which is a full uninterrupted sphere of sound, which composers can design in advance, just like they would any other creative parameter. And you use a special microphone to record 360-degree sound, and there's a lot of different scientific processes involved in coding the sound to make that ambisonic array. But it is what we call very enveloping and immersive audio, and that's a wonderful thing that recreates a very realistic sense of sound emanating from around you. And in the headphone space, we could say that the equivalent of ambisonic sound would be binaural sound. Binaural, of course, meaning 2 ears. And when you're encoding music to the binaural space, you're ensuring that the music sounds like it's emanating from outside your head and hitting your ears in the same way that it would in nature. So hitting one ear first and then the other ear with a slight time delay. So you can actually locate the sound in a very natural way that your brain understands, rather than having a simpler panning technique where you have sounds hitting one headphone only, because our brains don't locate it as easily. So binaural and ambisonic is a way of creating enveloping sound, which is very natural for our brains to understand and helps us to locate sound.
That's really cool.
Yeah. It's not something that I personally have delved into all that much. I'm interested in different sort of spatial designs for headphones in particular, but I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's used in many applications, including sort of therapeutic ones, for example, for chronic pain patients, because it's so enveloping, it takes you to another place. And that's just one amazing interdisciplinary application of it. But it can also be used by sound artists and composers if they want to create a soundscape, which in the same way that anyone else would, but they want it to sound very realistic. And that's an amazing immersive thing that you can do. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you can do it on headphones, though, as opposed to being in a very specifically fitted concert hall or space as advanced as those ambisonic ones.
Yeah. Absolutely. And those, and tertiary institutions are starting to get more of these ambisonic arrays. I know that some Wellington universities have them, and sonic architecture schools tend to have very immersive sound speaker arrays like that. But it's definitely not achievable for everyone. So it's important that we also look at other ways of diffusing sound that is, and sort of not discounting its creative prowess just because it's it's not made for the most technical application possible. I think that's really important. But binaural is an amazing way of creating realistic sounds emanating from the world around you without having to get into that too much. Yeah.
So, what processes have you been looking at in order to create those experiences for, particularly now where a lot of audiences are at home and can't really go to these very specific locations to experience very technical music? How are you doing it through portable devices like phones and whatever gear anyone has access to in their own homes?
So, my master's research looked at a new concept called small diffusion as opposed to large diffusion. So this was sort of a two-pronged concept, and the first one was very technically small diffusion being very accessible portable technologies like headphones, creating music for perhaps the sort of not great Apple EarPods, CD players, tape recorders, all those things that we have lying around in our homes, and just stereo speakers, which most people have these days. But on a cultural in the cultural discussion, small diffusion is a sort of cultural move away from really technological composition, and making sure that we note that you can make an amazingly immersive electroacoustic piece using really simple diffusion systems, and the considerations that need to go into these. For example, knowing the limited frequency response of small earphones, as opposed to a beautiful set of expensive loudspeakers, and then composing for that. That's a creative decision in and of itself, and using those parameters in a creative way to create a beautiful piece, I think, is very valuable and interesting. I think that the limitations of technology can be just as interesting as having no limitations in that way. And the other thing that I looked at was composing for the non-ideal listening space. So outside of the concert hall or traditional listening spaces where you might have distractions from light or distractions from sound, how do you compose a piece of sound work that people will listen to on a bus? And this could also include site-specific work, but it doesn't have to be. And so which frequency bands do you move away from? Can you have the full range of dynamics? Well, probably not. And in order to keep people's attention going, how do you work with environmental spaces to make music that communes with the outside world and teaches people to be mindful of their surroundings and those sounds, as well as take them away from it? So these were all questions that I asked of my research, and really enjoyed answering through creating a portfolio of works. And I think it was only the beginning of that discussion, because I decided to focus on headphone works and exploring interaural acoustic imaging, or in-head acoustic imaging, rather. Which is the phenomenon where just using very simple panning techniques and headphones, you create the idea that sounds are traveling through, in and around your head, rather than realistic binaural imaging, which of course means that sounds are emanating from outside your head, and that's what it sounds like to you. So really playing with that idea, which can be quite unsettling and uncomfortable, that sounds are traveling between your ears and rattling around your head. Yeah, because some people have explored it, but not that many, and it can be seen as a technical error. But I think that the inside of your head is a great space for creative exploration. So, and it's something that lots of sound artists can do without really having to access any sort of plugins or extra technology.
So now that you're saying that, it sort of rolls into my next question in terms of studying electronic music or sound design or anything technological like that. For example, when I started studying, I presumed that I would always need access to a relatively good studio in order to not just do the work, but to actually learn. And because you and I were at a music school, we were provided such facilities. But then if you're doing it by yourself, you need access to software like Logic, Cubase, or Maximus P, and then you need access to training or training materials in order to use some of this high-end software. So at that level, and now that you're a teacher, how has that been working with younger or new students in terms of considering access to tech, gear, and studios?
Absolutely. And that sort of question has become so relevant right now with COVID, and not everyone being able to come into university and having to learn online. So the processes that we would usually have in my music technology classes at the moment just can't occur. We can't have students always borrowing equipment because you have to think of sanitation and quarantine periods for the equipment. So there's not this easy transfer even within tertiary institutions. But I think that it poses an awesome opportunity to think about what we're imparting on students and this very technology focused way of learning, which doesn't have to be that way. So thinking about how you can use what you have in intelligent ways, like a smartphone. How can you change your environment to make a smartphone conducive to a good recording, or at least a good enough recording that you can play with and still use in creative ways? And even thinking about the kind of people who are admitted to tertiary institutions, what obstacles may they have had to overcome? Maybe they're not as advanced as other students, and thinking about why that might be the case. I think that in general the world is getting better at seeing past privilege and sort of being more empathetic in how we teach and who we teach, and that's incredibly important and increases the diversity of our amazing canon of music. And so that's one good thing that I think has come out of this period, which has been intense for everyone. And I think increasing accessibility in teaching is the way forward, and being someone who wasn't really a very technologically minded person and someone who struggled with understanding the most basic of jargon in the music technology world, I think that has permeated how I teach now. Even really simple ideas like EQ, and just using the word EQ in the first sentence of a class, and then stopping and thinking, they might not know that EQ means equalization, which is bringing up or attenuating different frequency bands to change a sound or sculpt a sound. So going back to that feeling of when you were in their shoes and maybe being too timid to ask questions or ask stupid questions, and trying to answer them beforehand so that everyone is brought up to the same level, so we can all start to think creatively instead of having to wade through all of the technology and the jargon. I think that is a really important way that we can make music technology more accessible and less intimidating for everyone, regardless of their background.
For our first intermission is an excerpt from one of my favourites of Alexis's compositions, entitled Scrapes and Sighs. You can enjoy this work on whatever device you have, but I should note that this excerpt and the next for our second intermission are mixed for headphones, so feel free to grab a pair of headphones or earphones if you happen to have them lying around. But now moving into how all of this links up with classical music, I often think that between classical music and popular culture, electronic music feels like it straddles a bit in between the two. And partly this is down to it being quite broad in terms of how you can apply the skills, particularly when you start learning. For example, in music technology class that you are now teaching, you can learn to be a sound designer, a sound artist, all the way through to being very specific acousmatic composers. So in classical music, generally when I see electronic music brought into performances or into programming, it is very often a work where the electronics is a component or it's combined with an ensemble or a soloist, and they tend to be acoustically performed or acoustic instruments. Or, for example, and I've really only seen this done once at the con actually, and it was for a wind symphony concert, they used 3 electronic pieces to join together the program of separate acoustic works. And for those pieces, the lights went down during those experiences so that you didn't have any visual distractions. Do you think that these are potentially ways of blending the two somewhat different genres together?
I think that's an interesting approach. And it's not something I made my mind up on yet, whether electroacoustic can exist in the exact same way as live classical music does. And I think that's because if we're talking about fixed media electroacoustic music, it doesn't have the same spontaneous visual component that classical music does. Mm-hmm. So if you go into a concert in that space of mind expecting to have visual stimulus as well as oral stimulus, it can be a bit jarring, I feel. Mm-hmm. So one way that we can get around that is to bring the lights down, to not give people a choice so their eyes can't wander and take them away from the experience. And I think in part that does work. I think other people have felt, oh no, I need people to have something to focus on while they listen to their music, so they might introduce a visual component. So there's many ways to tackle that question, and I think it depends on the composer, what their goals are with the work, and whether they feel that the content works in the same environment as live classical music. And I think that mixed music, which is what I would refer to with instrumental and tape, is a wonderful way of straddling that divide, because it does show that sound and music exist in the same sphere, and that sound and instruments can be extensions of one another, timbrally and texturally, and that they can all work towards the same musical goal. So, and it preserves that live element as well, the spontaneity and the excitement of seeing someone perform on stage and respond to the sound. So the jury's out on that one. And I think that everyone would have a different opinion, because while I would very, very happily sit in an auditorium with a bunch of other people in the dark and listen to that, I'm not sure everyone would. And that's to do with our context and our backgrounds, and, you know, whether you decide that sound is music or whether it's just a bit of crap in between the good stuff. We can also use technology to preserve that spontaneous live element as well. If we think about how live electronic performers use different speakers to respond to, or technology that is performative as part of the electronic work, then that's a way around that, and it sort of shows how the sound is being made. So if you're interested in having your audience participate in technological listening and think, oh, how is that machine making that noise, then that can be really interesting. Or you can think to a more traditional acousmatic diffusion technique, which is the acousmonium, where you had lots of different speakers of different sizes and frequency responses dotted around a room, and you would diffuse the sound live as a sort of sound performance. And so the creative decisions by the technician was part of the experience, and so it was a performance. So now that we have all of these opportunities, we can think, well, do I want the technology to be part of the performance? Do I want my audience to just sit in the dark room? And I think that the end result is just as important as it is in classical music now. thinking about where your music is going to end up. For me, it's usually on headphones, and I'm imagining it being experienced in the home or by yourself. It's a very intimate, individual experience, but it's not the same for everyone. Yeah, so I think that is a really important consideration for composers in electroacoustic music.
I just had a flashback to the time you and I went to the premiere of Joe Manton's piece in Hornsby, and I'm sure there were other people who are listening now who actually went to that performance last year because it was actually packed. And it surprised me because it was a single piece of music that was an hour long and it was entirely electronic. And he rented out, oh, I can't remember now.
It was a movie theatre.
Yes, that's right. It was the movie theatre in Hornsby, Westfield, and it was a really full concert. And we all sat in the dark in this theatre, and it worked.
It worked. It absolutely worked, and it was just the amazing detail of that piece. I don't think would have no visual element could have done it justice, and it would have taken away from the intense concentration needed to really experience it. So that is one case where I feel that sound should exist for sound alone, and we shouldn't think about too many other elements. So again, a good example of that. It's definitely not a case of one method suits every composition.
And one thing I remember that was really jarring was that because we had entered a movie theatre space and I was unprepared for what was going to be unveiled, I presumed that there would be visuals.
Yes, absolutely. So we come in with our own assumptions and expectations of what's going to happen. And I think, and that is such a part of that, we've all gone into a concert where we feel, oh, I know exactly how this is going to go. And you walk out and you think that is nothing like what I expected. And whether that's a good thing, sometimes it is, sometimes it's a bad thing. So it's interesting how the audience member can change the narrative in their minds and how their expectations color the piece and their experience of it. And the composer has absolutely no control over that after a certain degree and a certain amount of planning. Yeah.
That's so true. Well, actually, I was thinking about what you said about live performance because I actually don't know that much about live electronic performance other than attending some really cool festival gigs here and there and, also things that I think have now filtered into popular culture. For example, Australian artists like Flume. And that aspect of sound design and working with music technology has now become a bit more mainstream in the media and also mainstream experiences. So when it comes to live performance and having spoken to classical musicians, there is a belief that it's different or not truly live performance because there is one person on the stage who is behind a heavy desk with gear and tech. So because there is the presumption that electronic music is all fixed, is there a stigma or preconceived notion that people who do live performance or live media in electronics aren't actually affecting the sound or the sound experiences in any way?
Yes, I'd agree. I think it's there's this assumption that a lot of it is just pushing a button and then playing along with it. And you know what? I don't even mind if it is. It's not most of the time. I know this. I think it's for a lot of live performers, and I'm not an electronic music performer. I prefer to make fixed media, very set works. But when I go to live electronic music in the more sound art sense, I wouldn't say that I go to many EDM concerts or anything like that. Well, especially not now. But I get the overwhelming feeling that it's just like a performer that's rehearsed a work. You have an idea of how a piece is going to go, and you might respond a little bit more to the stimuli in the room, or you might decide on a whim, oh, perhaps I'll extend this section a little bit more. But for me, it is a performance in the exact same way that any instrumentalist would perform. It's rehearsed or it's improvised, which instrumentalists do as well. And you are responding to the combination of sounds that you're creating and what the people around you are experiencing. So in conclusion, I think that even if you are touching a button and then dancing along, that's visual stimuli to go along with this planned experience that you've created for people, and that's fine. But I think more often than not, it's a practice and rehearsed performance which should be respected, just like it would be for any instrumentalist, because I think different considerations have gone in, but they are considerations nonetheless. This is a prepared piece which is being presented to you. And I think that's important to remember.
So, then moving from this, some of the other things I wish to touch on were slightly more conceptual things, like music in the world of sound design and practicing electronic music, and whether or not that leads to you being more aware of the sounds around us, or perhaps more than what we are describing at the beginning, which are the concerns of instrumentation and orchestration and harmony. So, at least when I was studying electronic music, it really opened up my ears to listening to everything, really, from audience members in a space, even thinking spatially when I compose acoustic music now. And as a result, I have a acute awareness of the space it will be premiered in and who by, which then affects an experience of the work. All the way to listening to our environment. And there's been a long history of composers like yourself doing field work and field recordings, which then informs their work. So, how would you then introduce people to the world of listening deeply?
Well, I think first of all, I would say that as you mentioned before, when you started to learn about sound art and electroacoustic music, it opened up your idea of how instrumental music could exist and what is possible on the spectrum of sounds there. And I think that that is the magic between sound and instrumental music. They complement each other and they extend the palette that is available for each other. Even if you're not using any sort of electronic means in a performance, if you've been working with sound and you're thinking about how you can use sound creatively, you might approach what you can do on an instrument in a different way. You might think about extended techniques and using different parts of the instrument which weren't traditionally used to create new textures and soundscapes. So I think in that way, it's important that we hear mixed music, and it's important that we think of and are taught to appreciate sound as music, because they're not different concepts. They exist on a spectrum. And I think that electroacoustic composers just tend to work at the far end of that spectrum, and people who are purely instrumental would work at the other end, but there is somewhere in the middle that you can meet. It's not somewhere that I travel to often, but that, that opportunity is there, and that's a wonderful thing. So moving on from that, how would I introduce people to the idea of sound as music? I think that sound in music is rooted in nature and natural processes. So, for example, I've done a project for children and creating a sound story where I sort of contextualize different sounds made by natural objects in a story about frogs being called back to a certain area that was very dry by making noises that resembled rain out of found sounds like rocks and sticks and leaves, and creating music that frogs would like. And that was really fun because I think it got kids thinking about the environment and how different sounds could be made rhythmic, or the different textures could be fun, and we can appreciate them as an art form as well. And of course, not every sound is going to be music, but perhaps if we organize them, we can appreciate that collage of sounds as an art form resembling music. So I think it's important to remember that sound art, and especially how I tend to compose, is very much to do with the physics of sound in nature. So thinking about things like sonic looming and how sounds rush towards us and then they rush off in a Doppler effect. And that's something that we hear in nature a lot. It's a phenomenon that we all respond to deep in our psyche. The idea of, I suppose, a more organic way of structuring a piece, so letting a sound repeat and grow and extend in a very natural way, sort of like the flowering of a plant over time, or like breath as we go about our day or do different movements. So for me, I feel that sound is, especially with field recordings and treating sound and its behaviours like different processes in life, we can really relate to it. This is a very long-winded answer. I get really excited about this sort of aesthetic discussion because I think the way that we can compose sound is just so different to the way that we structure instrumental music. And I think that if we meet somewhere in the middle, we can give structure to sound, but we can also make composition in general a more organic process, which follows the processes of the body and the processes of nature. And whether you're using synthesized sound, bleeps and bloops, and making them behave in that way, or you're using field recordings, which are very anecdotal and we can definitely tell where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
If you're thinking about sound in a way that you find appealing and a way that resonates with you, in that collation of sounds can be music. And so I think with my work especially, it's not meant so much for people who know a lot about electroacoustic music or music theory, who are music aficionados. It's meant to inspire wonder in people who don't, and get them thinking, oh, that's a great sound that I just heard as I walked by. I can imagine that in a piece. Yeah, it's about fun and adventure and appreciating sound in the world around us and being more mindful of the sounds that we have.
And I think what I definitely love about your music is that you've managed to create these little pockets and these little inner worlds where you can experience these new sounds, but despite that, there are these little moments of the familiar within them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think I call myself an acousmatic composer, but if we think of acousmatic in a very strict sense, acousmatic listening is listening to the sound for the sound itself and trying to achieve that idea of reduced listening, where you're not associating the sound with anything. You're just appreciating the sound for its tone and its texture and how it evolves. But I don't think that in our day and age that is possible. I think that technology gets in the way, or I think the human mind would think, oh, that sounds like an elephant, or it sounds a bit like an elephant, and then you start thinking about elephants. So I think that instead we need to play on that, and for me that involves leaving something familiar in my sounds or making them behave like something in real life. So for example, in one piece, The Shimmering Haze, I have lots of little sound objects which are just created by generating high sine tones, but for me, they wiggle through the sound space like a goldfish, and that was what's in my mind as I'm exploring that sound. And I think that adds an element of fun to it, and maybe predictability in how it moves. And I would hope that even if a listener doesn't have that association, they might be able to see the sound in their mind's eye and create a sort of ecosystem of it. And so it's just another way of looking at sound and looking at music. And I've found that the more that I think about that, the more I see instrumental music and more traditional forms of music in that way as well. So it's about conjuring a sound image, I suppose, and making it fun.
Oh, I definitely agree. Studying electronic music is what gave me an easier way of understanding the shape of a sound. Not as a still image, but as a moving form or a silhouette. For example, if previously I were to listen to a wall of sound, which sometimes is a symphony, I wouldn't feel that as clearly. I would have focused on details like harmonic progressions are doing this and the instrumentation is doing this. But now I can stand back and listen to these works in a way that sound art, in a sense, trained my ears to do so. So you can feel and touch and see and hear moving shapes that move together vertically and horizontally. So it was incredibly useful to learn how to listen like that through music technology.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that the way that I listen to instrumental music and orchestral music in particular has changed a lot, and it makes me wonder if some of the composers that we know so well thought in the same way. It makes you really really wonder how more. I mean, we have a lot of different ways of analyzing music, but it makes me wonder if maybe they were thinking about music in the way that I think about sound. And that's made me appreciate orchestral music so much more than I ever did when I wanted to be an orchestral composer. Thinking about timbre and thinking, oh, they've used the violins in such an interesting way to contrast with some of the low instruments here, and thinking about how those sounds move in my mind's eye rather than in my ear, I suppose. I think that we exposing ourselves to sound as a form of music does allow us to see and hear music in a different way in our minds, and a way that just gives another dimension of appreciation and understanding of it.
For our second intermission is an excerpt from another one of my favourites of Alexis's work, this one being the one she mentioned before, called The Shimmering Haze. You'll soon find out why once you have a little bit of a listen. And now I'm thinking back to one of those old Disney films, and I think it was Fantasia. And there's a scene which accompanies the music, and I cannot remember the piece of classical music that was playing, but I distinctly remember these shapes of color moving across the screen and dancing, kind of like the old Microsoft movement to music shapes software that they used to have. And your description of sound as music and it moving in your mind's eye brings that to mind. But now I realize I've gone full circle and I have to ask about your research as well as your practice. You had started your honours degree just as I finished up at the con, but I do remember you were already investigating electronic music and your whole portfolio was in that field. But the research component was so compelling, particularly because I had experienced similar feelings or understood where some of those statistics came from, particularly having worked in studios or being a part of studio culture.
That's right. So for my honours, I had my electroacoustic portfolio, which I really enjoyed delving into, but my research was sort of another thing entirely, and that was my real curiosity at the time, was finding out more about female electroacoustic composers in Australia. Because I found that in my earlier years of study, when we had examples of different composers in our classes, a lot of them, well, it was resoundingly male. And so that didn't help me to be encouraged to pursue music technology and electroacoustic composition. So I thought, and it didn't consciously bother me at the time, but as I went on, it did. And so I decided I wanted to learn more about people like me who composed music in the way that I do. And so I embarked on my my honours thesis in that way, and I interviewed 4 electroacoustic composers in Australia, or composers who incorporated electronic elements into their practice. And that was Kezia Yap, who I knew from the con and who had just sort of graduated at the time, Fiona Hill, who was in the Blue Mountains, Kat Hope, who a lot of us would be familiar with, and Leah Barclay from Griffith University in Queensland. And I set out with a few different goals in mind. One was to just learn more about their composing process, to see how they differed, what I could find that was sort of a through line in their processes, and see how that could help me and others. To find out how they felt about the current gender balance in Australian music, especially electroacoustic music, but it turned into a much broader discussion, as it always does, because nothing is in isolation. And then to hear about some of the challenges and the different goals that they had in writing their music. So what obstacles did they come up against? And then what was the end goal for their music? And how did that affect their processes? And it turned out that everyone had such different goals for what they were doing and ways of existing within the electronic community, and that that really influenced how they worked, what technology they used, if they used technology at all, if they were live performers in their own work, or whether they saw their electroacoustic practice as an extension of predominantly instrumental practice. And that was so fascinating to me, because I hadn't really delved into the work of any of them. And I don't think that's because I wasn't interested. I think that's because in my earlier classes, I hadn't really even been aware that they existed or had any sort of direction towards them. And I think that that was an issue. But as soon as I found that, I felt more reassured in what I was doing, because it was a little bit different to what other students were doing at the time. I was very interested in the acousmatic way of composing and fixed media, rather than getting into live electronic performance or installations or messing about with large diffusion, which are all wonderful things to do, but it just wasn't something that I really resonated with. But I felt so much more confident after that, that you can exist as an electroacoustic composer in so many ways, and your goals will dictate how you work. You don't have to have the equipment, and you don't have to necessarily have expensive plugins to make beautiful and striking music. And that was something that every single participant said to me, that it didn't matter about the technology, and it didn't necessarily matter about your know-how after a certain point. It was about your ideas and how well you executed them, which I think is always the thing in across all genres of music. And that was really comforting in a way, because it gave me the confidence to say, well, if I'm not necessarily interested in this area of the technology, then I won't pursue it. I'll spend my time pursuing what I want to pursue and finding my own voice. And after that, I found that I did find my own voice, and before that I was struggling. So that was a truly beneficial research topic for me, and I got so much out of it. And from then on, I found that it was easier for me to seek out other female electroacoustic composers, and think about the ways in which we all create music and why we create it. And from there, listening to different female and gender diverse artists, and also appreciating male artists as well as just being one section of electroacoustic music, rather than that practice and their music as being the whole thing. And I think that made me appreciate it more too. So it really benefited my listening to everyone. And I think that it could do the same for all students. The more that we show a broad and encompassing list of examples from people across different walks of life, different races, different experiences and different genders, then our students will be more well equipped to understand how their music fits into that world. Yeah.
Exactly. And because you're teaching now, has that been something you've been actively doing, trying to offer a wider range of repertoire for students to study and interact with to begin with?
Yes, I think so, across listening and across research, across the sort of academic ideas that are coming out of this space. And it's not that I'm trying to push an agenda at all. I think I try and tailor my listening homework to my student. But now that I am equipped with more knowledge of how no way is the right way, I think that I can customize my recommendations and who we talk about to each student according to their goals. And that's been a really wonderful outcome of being sort of switched on in this space. So I definitely do try and lead by example with who I recommend students listen to, and why to listen to them. What is it that we can learn from them as well?
Indeed, and when it comes to a listening practice, by the time you listen, you can't really tell the identity, like gender or race of the artist, purely through listening. So by encouraging this broader engagement with what is happening out there, it's not really pushing a political or a feminist agenda, it's just about trying to listen to some good art and good music.
For me, it is about pushing an agenda, and it's about pushing the agenda of having a well-rounded listening practice, because I think that you can't have that unless you listen to a really broad range of styles and processes and technological priorities in your composers, and you only get that when you're listening to everyone and you're able to listen to everyone, and you're encouraged to. And I think undertaking that honours research at the time was also about investigating whether there was a female sound in electroacoustic music, and surprise, surprise, there was not. But to a certain extent, because there were one or two token female representatives in particular of electroacoustic music, who perhaps a very mainstream sound within acousmatic music in particular, I expected that was the path I had to go down, and it just wasn't. So I think that my experience and my undertaking of that research can hopefully benefit the next lot of students coming through, so that they feel like they are open to explore whatever pathways and styles and genres they want, whether that be very aggressively spatialized electroacoustic music in that very British style, or whether it's mixed music, which is very ambient and gentle. Being able to embrace that and be proud of that and say, this is what I've decided that I want to do, and this electroacoustic music is just as much electroacoustic music as yours is, which might be more technological and maybe interdisciplinary, things like that.
Actually, I will make your thesis accessible for anyone who might be interested in your research in a little link below, and also in the transcript, because I think it's excellent. And on another note, you were really kind enough to send me this brilliant list of recommended resources for me to look at, which I'll also provide for everybody else. And is it right that a lot of these have informed your research and your thinking?
So at the time of my honours research, I was really inspired by the Female Pressure Network, who is an amazing network of female and non-binary composers who come together every 2 years and release a collection of statistics about electronic music festivals, concerts, and the percentages of programming of male composers versus female composers, non-binary composers, and people existing on the gender spectrum. And it's so illuminating to see how things have remained the same, where they've become slightly better, and they've just released their 2020 statistics, which will obviously slightly be affected by the cancellation of many events, but I'm sure will still be illuminating. So I'm looking forward to delving into that. And that was a real starting point for me in my research there. And I think that two particularly influential bodies of research existing outside and inside the academic sphere were the two keynote artists from the Australasian Computer Music Conference this year, Eve Klein and Bridget Chappell, who both talked about how we can make electronic music more inclusive and ways that we can encourage absolutely everyone to engage in that, whether it be the coding side of things or whether it's from an aesthetic style. And so I'd encourage anyone listening to go and view those two keynotes, which are on YouTube, on the ACMC's YouTube page. So I think that I'm really encouraged by people who are already making huge waves in this field, and that has absolutely influenced my teaching style and makes me very mindful of how I'm teaching and what kind of assumptions I'm imparting on my students. And another amazing book, which is a little bit older by now, it was Tara Rogers' Pink Noises, which was really the original inspiration for my curiosities. It's a book, a compilation of interviews of different electroacoustic artists who talk about their very different approaches to composing, whether that be improvised, whether that be live performance or fixed media, and the different technologies they use, including tape, turntables, all the way through to our most modern technologies, and how it's still relevant today and still really valuable art making. And so I still want to know more about how that applies in Australia, in our academic institutions, outside our academic institutions. And that's another wonderful resource for people to delve into and just keep reading whenever you can, because it's a deep dive, but it's just mind-blowing the ways that people approach electronic music, and the results that they get out of those composing processes is so inspiring.
Definitely. And thank you for sharing this all with us. And I love that there's this whole body of research being amassed everywhere, in all manners of study, but particularly in the world of music, tech, and electroacoustic music, all through your own research. And it's incredible that now you're teaching there at the Sydney Con. I think it will definitely have an impact, because I remember the Con Studios and music tech department being entirely male when I was there.
That's absolutely right. And I hope that I feel like it doesn't matter. I don't know if we'll put this online, but I don't care if I was hired for playing the gender card, because I know that I have something unique to offer. Mm-hmm. And I think that regardless of whether I've questioned that before, it's still important, and it doesn't matter why I ended up there. It just matters what I impart, and mm-hmm. whether it does in fact have the desired result, which is to make a difference on people's assumptions about electronic composition, who can teach it, who's an authority on it, which is the big thing. I might share an anecdote, actually. I was, when I was asked to take over from another tutor who was teaching my class, we talked about some of the assumptions of students coming into the class. Being a first year class, people would be coming in with no history of tertiary involvement in electronic music and how to learn about it and who learns about it. And one student, a male student, remarked to another student, "Oh, there's girls in this class," very audibly. And it, according to the tutor, he sort of saw this female student sort of shrink in on herself and become very shy. And I think that, knowing that the first student meant no harm by it and he was probably making a joke, it just goes to highlight what underlying assumptions there were in that age group and that particular cohort about who would be learning electronic music. And I think that made me nervous coming in, because I thought, what if some of my students don't think that I'm an authority on what I'm teaching? And I don't know all the answers to everything, because I'm one person, and we all have completely different ways of arriving at what we're good at. And so there are times when I don't have all the answers, and I constantly worry that means that my authority on absolutely everything that I teach is undermined. But I also think that there's this thing with me where I want to please everyone and be liked and respected by everyone, which is never going to happen. And I think it's been a real journey accepting that, even if the way that I've come to where I am now has been different to other people's journey, it doesn't mean that my practice is any less valuable or thought out. It's certainly not ignorant, but there will be gaps in everyone's knowledge, and that's how it should be, because we all have to specialize in different things. And some people are a jack of all trades, and that's part of their amazing compositional voice, and that's a wonderful thing. But it's what we specialize in which makes us all unique and contributes to an incredible patchwork and a quilt of electroacoustic music. So I think we need to embrace that, and embrace what we're really good at. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, I was very nervous coming into teaching in a tertiary institution, just being one person and someone who's quite fresh out of a tertiary institution myself, on whether I would be seen as having enough authority to teach others. So I would say that there are probably a lot of people like me around the world at different tertiary institutions who are wondering if they're equipped to teach and having this imposter syndrome. But and I think that's a journey and a growth that we all have to figure out ourselves. But it's definitely something that continues, even though we know that that we are fit to teach. I think that because of our experiences and the context of where we are, it can be hard to overcome that. So that's an ongoing issue and interesting development.
I think you also learn while doing the teaching, as teaching is also a practice in and of itself.
Yes. And allowing yourself to make mistakes, but not doubting yourself to a point where you actually undermine your own efforts to teach people. Yeah.
That's incredibly useful advice to any up and coming teachers or any already teachers.
Absolutely. Don't undermine your own confidence by doubting yourself. I mean, we can doubt ourselves in order to become better, but I don't think that losing confidence because you're worried about what people might think of your practice and how you work, and whether you teaching that will be damaging to how they learn electroacoustic music. I don't think that's helpful to consider. I think we need not to discount those anxieties if they're going to make us better teachers, but to not let it undermine your confidence, and be aware that what you share is going to be valuable and will allow people to find their own voice rather than copy yours.
And I think that's an absolutely perfect note to end our conversation on, allowing people to find their own voice rather than to copy yours. Well, you're definitely a teacher. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your words and all your wisdom with us, as well as your music. I hope it's given everyone who's listening something else to think about, considering electronic music, and also thinking about listening deeply and listening widely. Thank you so much, Alexis.
Not at all. No, I'm I'm so honoured and privileged to be part of this podcast, and I always enjoy chatting to you, and we don't get to chat enough considering that we, we went through uni together. So
Exactly.
yeah, this is such an exciting project, and I'm really glad that I can add my particular perspective to it.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. And, as usual, I'm going to leave all the links, your thesis, all the resources you've given me, and some of your music down below, and anything else we have touched on today. And thank you, everyone who's listening, and I'll catch you all next time.